60 years old, and the city is going broke. Let me tell you about that first, because the city going broke is not background to 1975. It is 1975, at least from where I sit in this corner of it. The city going broke is the weather, the air, the specific quality of unease that runs through every conversation in every coffee shop in Manhattan this October, including this one, including the conversation I'm about to have with you. New York City in October 1975 is technically still operating. The buses are running, intermittently. The subway is running, covered in graffiti from end to end, but running. I'll tell you about the graffiti, because the graffiti is also 1975, and also not simple. The libraries are open 4 days a week instead of 6, because there is no money for the extra 2 days. And this is the kind of thing that sounds like a minor logistical adjustment, until you consider that the people who need the library most are the people for whom the library's 4-day schedule creates the greatest hardship, which is always how the economics of scarcity arrange themselves. The services that cost the most to lose are the ones cut first, because the people who would lose them have the least political leverage to prevent the cutting. I learned this in the Depression. I am watching it again. In October 1975, the city's finances are in a state that the word crisis understates. The city is, in the practical sense of the word, bankrupt. It cannot pay its bills. It cannot make payroll for its municipal workers. Without borrowing money, it has no current means to repay. It has been borrowing and borrowing, and the lenders have begun, in the specific way that lenders eventually do, to look at the mountain of debt and say, we need to discuss this differently. President Ford, Gerald Ford, who is president by the specific accident of having been the replacement for the president, which is the kind of succession that tends not to produce strong executive confidence. President Ford declined to support a federal bailout of New York City, and the Daily News, which is not always a newspaper known for the elegance of its headlines, produced in response a headline that is perfect in its compression. He didn't actually say those words. The headline paraphrased an attitude rather than a statement, but the paraphrase was so accurate to the attitude that the distinction became irrelevant, and the headline has entered the vocabulary of this city's self-understanding in the way that accurate statements always do. By sticking, by returning, by becoming the shorthand for something that would otherwise require a paragraph. I cut it out. I have it at home, in a drawer, with various other newspaper clippings I've collected over the years, when a headline managed to compress a truth into a form that felt permanent. It is next to the headline from October 1955 about the Dodgers winning the World Series. The proximity seems appropriate. The best day and one of the worst days of the same city, separated by 20 years and several filing systems. I want to tell you what it actually looks like to live inside a city that is going broke, because the phrase, New York City's fiscal crisis, has the flattening quality of all economic abstractions. It sounds like a condition that exists in spreadsheets and bond markets and government offices, rather than a condition that exists in the specific Tuesday afternoon texture of walking down a specific block of a specific street and feeling something that wasn't there 10 years ago. Here is what it looks like. It looks like Times Square. In 1947, when I first started sitting at this table, Times Square was, I have described it before and I'll describe it again because comparison is the whole point of this exercise. Times Square was noisy and bright and excessive, in the way that New York in general was noisy and bright and excessive, which is to say it was a genuine expression of the city's energy, rather than a performance of it. The theaters were running plays that people actually came to see. The restaurants were full of people who lived in New York and used the neighborhood as part of their regular life. The marquees were advertising productions that meant something to the people reading them. Times Square in 1975 is something different. Times Square in 1975 is what happens when a city stops being able to afford its own aspirations. The theaters are still there, some of them. Some have been converted. I will not describe in detail what some of them have been converted to, because this is a family program, and also because the specifics are not the point. The point is the atmosphere, which is transactional, slightly menacing, organized around the extraction of money from people who are themselves often being extracted from, which is the specific economic ecology of a neighborhood that has been abandoned by its previous constituency and occupied by the entrepreneurial energies of a different one. I still walk through Times Square occasionally. I walk through it because I have been walking through Times Square since I was 14 years old, and I refuse to cede the geography of my own city to a condition that I am confident is not permanent. But I notice the difference. Thomas says I am being stubborn. I say, all right. But I'm being stubborn in Times Square, so at least the obstinacy is located somewhere interesting. The Bronx. I need to talk about the Bronx. In 1977, 2 years from now, which I am mentioning because the seeds of it are already visible in 1975, the sportscaster Howard Cosell will be in the broadcast booth during the World Series, reporting on a game at Yankee Stadium, and the camera will pull back to show the buildings burning in the South Bronx, visible from the stadium, and Cosell will say, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." It will become one of the defining images of the decade. But in 1975, the burning has already been going on for years. It's just that the World Series camera hasn't found it yet. What is happening in the South Bronx is the product of a specific, traceable set of decisions. The Cross Bronx Expressway, built by Robert Moses in the 1950s, cut through the heart of the Bronx with the particular indifference to existing communities that characterized large infrastructure projects of that era. It displaced tens of thousands of people, destroyed established neighborhoods, and left behind a corridor of disconnection that began the erosion of the borough's economic fabric. Then, the mortgage redlining that locked Black and Latino families out of home ownership in the suburbs, while locking them into deteriorating housing stock in the city. Then the landlords who discovered that a building could be worth more burned than maintained, the insurance payout exceeding the value of a building they could no longer rent at a profit. Then the arson epidemic that followed from that discovery, systematic and cynical and devastating to the people who lived in those buildings, who were not consulted about their landlord's financial calculations. The Bronx is burning. The people in the buildings when they burn are poor. They are disproportionately Black and Latino. They are people for whom the city's fiscal crisis means something specific and material. Not the abstract anxiety of a city that can no longer service its debt, but the concrete reality of fire stations closed in their neighborhood precisely when the arson rate is rising. Of police precincts underfunded at the moment when the social fabric that prevents crime is fraying fastest. I live on the Upper West Side. I am not in the South Bronx. I am aware, every time I consider the distance, that being in the position of the aware observer rather than the affected party is itself a form of privilege that deserves acknowledgement rather than comfortable silence. So I acknowledge it. And then I say what I think needs to be said about what I see, which is a city that permits this to happen to some of its residents while protecting others is a city that has made a choice about which residents count. That choice is not made in a single moment, in a single policy, by a single decision-maker. It accretes over decades through 1,000 smaller choices, each of which can be rationalized individually, and none of which can be rationalized in aggregate. The Bronx is burning. It should not be burning. The people who know why it is burning know exactly why. I want to tell you about August 8, 1974. Not because it's 1975, it's a year ago, 14 months ago, the wound still fresh enough to shape the present. I want to tell you because August 8th, 1974, is a night that belongs in this accounting of this decade's specific character, and because I watched it happen in a way that felt, at the time, unreal, and feels, in retrospect, like the most real thing the decade produced. I was in my living room. Richard Nixon appeared on the television. He had been appearing on the television for the better part of 2 years at that point, since the Watergate break-in in June 1972, since the Senate hearings in 1973, since the revelation of the tapes and the revelation of the 18-and-a-half-minute gap in the tapes, and the revelation that the gap was deliberate, and the revelation of what the non-gap portions of the tapes revealed, which was a president who spoke and thought in ways that would have surprised many of the people who had voted for him. I had been watching all of it. I want to tell you that the Watergate scandal was, for me, a civics lesson delivered at the level of lived experience rather than classroom instruction. I had lived through FDR and Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson, through administrations that were flawed and capable, and occasionally both simultaneously. Through the specific American institution of the president as a figure who carries a certain weight of national meaning that the office confers and the individual either justifies or fails to justify. Nixon failed to justify it in a way that was, I want to find the right word, clarifying. Not because corruption in government was new. I am 60 years old, and I have been reading newspapers since the 1920s, and I have not been naive about the relationship between power and self-interest since approximately 1935. But because Watergate made explicit, in a way that previous corruptions had managed to keep implicit, what the corruption actually was. Not a rogue operation by overzealous supporters. A president directing from the Oval Office a campaign of criminal activity against his political opponents, and then directing from the same office the cover-up of that campaign, and being caught, and resigning. For the first time in American history, a president of the United States resigned from office. I watched the speech. Thomas was beside me. We didn't speak during it. Thomas and I have a habit of not speaking during things that require full attention, a habit that has served our marriage well over the years in various contexts. Nixon said a number of things during the speech. He said he had always tried to do what was best for the nation. He said he no longer had a strong enough political base in Congress. He said he would resign the next day. He said, and this is the sentence I keep coming back to, the one that seemed to me at the time and still seems to me to be the most revealing. He said, "I have always tried to do what was best for the nation." Always. That word. In the specific context of a speech that was itself the admission that what he had done was not what was best for the nation, that always is doing an extraordinary amount of work. It is the word of a man who has organized his self-understanding around intentions rather than actions, who believes that what matters about what he did is what he was trying to do when he did it, rather than what he actually did. I have spent my professional life studying the difference between what people perform and what they are, between the face they present and the face underneath, between intention and execution, between what someone says they mean and what the specific words they chose actually mean. That always told me everything I needed to know about Richard Nixon. And it told me something else besides, something about the human capacity to maintain a self-image in the face of evidence, to narrate one's own story in a way that preserves the protagonist's fundamental innocence, regardless of what the protagonist has done. It is, I think, one of the most human things there is. It is also the quality that makes people capable of exactly the kind of harm Nixon did. He resigned the next morning. Gerald Ford became president. A month later, Ford pardoned Nixon for all crimes he might have committed while in office. I will not tell you what I said when I read that in the newspaper at this table, because this is, as I mentioned, a family program. April 29th, 1975. Saigon. The image is a helicopter on the roof of a building. Not a military helicopter, a small civilian helicopter. People climbing a ladder to reach it. The photograph that will appear in every history book. A line of people on a narrow exterior staircase, reaching upward. I watched the news coverage from this city, from my living room, with the specific numbness that had been building since 1965, when the first large troop deployments went, through 1968, when Tet happened, and the official optimism became permanently unsustainable, through 1969, when the My Lai massacre became public knowledge, through the years of Nixon's Peace with Honor, which produced neither peace nor honor, through the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, which produced a pause rather than an ending, through 1975 and the final collapse. 58,000 Americans. I keep coming back to that number. 58,000 Americans. And millions of Vietnamese. Numbers that don't fit the same scale of American public grief, which is itself a fact about American public life that deserves its own reckoning. I was alive when this war began, in the specific background sense in which wars begin. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, 1964. The authorization for the president to use military force, voted on in the Senate with 2 dissenting votes, passed with the specific velocity of something that is not being looked at closely enough. I watched it begin. I watched 20 years pass. I watched it end on a rooftop in Saigon, with a helicopter and a line of people, and the specific expression on the faces of the people on the ground who were not going to make it onto the helicopter. What I want to say about this, and I want to say it carefully because I am 60 years old, and I have learned through those years that careful saying is not the same as restrained feeling, is this. The difference between Vietnam and World War II is not that one was a good war and one was a bad war, in the simplistic register of that terminology. The difference is that World War II was, whatever its internal contradictions and its costs, a war whose outcome was legible. The enemy was defeated. The thing the war was meant to stop, the expansion of fascism by force across Europe and Asia, was stopped. The victory was real, and the relief was real, and the communal experience of that reality was, in its complexity and its grief and its genuine joy, coherent. Vietnam has no such legibility. Vietnam ends on a rooftop with a helicopter and 58,000 names, and the specific knowledge that the outcome the war was supposed to produce, a stable, democratic, non-communist South Vietnam, was not produced, and that everyone in the relevant government offices knew for years before the end that it would not be produced, and chose to continue anyway, and sent more names into the list that will eventually be carved into a wall in Washington. I think about the men who were on that list. I think about the men who came back, and about what coming back meant. Not the welcome home parades of 1945, not the GI Bill and the subsidized mortgages, and the specific American narrative of the veteran as hero returned. The opposite of that in some cases. The specific indignity of returning from a war that the country had turned against while you were fighting it, of being the face of something the country was ashamed of being handed the specific and impossible task of carrying both the experience of the war and the country's discomfort with the war simultaneously. I think about what that does to a person. I think about what it does to a generation. This is 1975. The answers to those questions are still being produced, in veterans' hospitals and in the particular silences of men who came back with things they cannot say in the language available to them. The answers will take decades. Some of them will never be fully produced. The helicopter is on the roof. the war is over. What does over mean when nothing was resolved? I promised to tell you about the subway graffiti. The subway cars of New York in 1975 are covered, not adorned, covered. Every inch of the exterior of most cars, and much of the interior, has been painted by an operation so systematic and so persistent that the Transit Authority, which has been attempting to combat it for years, has essentially lost the argument. The trains are moving exhibitions, rolling, underground, daily ridden exhibitions. I have opinions about this that I want to share, with the awareness that my opinions are complicated and perhaps contradictory, and I intend to honor the complication rather than resolve it into a tidy position. On the level of the practical, the graffiti is expensive to remove, and the Transit Authority, which is broke, cannot afford to remove it quickly or thoroughly. It is associated in the public consciousness with the general sense of civic deterioration, with the broken windows, the delayed trains, the stations that have not been maintained, the sense that the city has stopped being able to enforce the basic agreements that public life requires. People who are afraid of crime and dirt and disorder look at the graffiti and see more crime and dirt and disorder. Whether that perception is accurate is a separate question from whether it is real as a perception. And it is very real as a perception. On the level of the visual, some of it is extraordinary. I want to say this carefully because I am aware that saying some of the graffiti is extraordinary sounds like the opinion of someone who is not riding the subway every day, and therefore has the luxury of aesthetic appreciation that practical consequences render unavailable to those who are. But I ride the subway. I have ridden it for 45 years, and some of what I see on these cars, the scale of it, the color, the specific ambition of someone who has chosen the side of a subway car as their canvas, precisely because the subway car is the most public, most democratic, most unavoidable surface in the city. Some of it is genuinely extraordinary art, made under genuinely extraordinary constraints. The people making it are young, mostly Black and Latino, mostly from the boroughs that have been most thoroughly abandoned by the civic investments that would have given them alternative canvases. They are painting on what is available. They are painting at enormous personal risk. The Transit Authority arrests people for this. The third rail is lethal. The yards where the cars sit at night are dangerous. They are painting anyway, because they are people who need to make something, and the city has not provided them with the rooms and the teachers and the materials that would have let them make it somewhere else. I think about this when I see a particularly beautiful piece on a particular car. I think, what would this person do with a wall and permission? And then I think, what would this city produce if it directed the same resources toward the people who are doing this that it's currently directing toward stopping them from doing this? I don't have the answer. I have the question. I ride the subway every Tuesday. Here is something that should not work as an entry point to a discussion of the human capacity for joy, and yet is precisely that. The pet rock. In 1975, a man named Gary Dahl sold approximately 1.5 million rocks. I want to be precise. Gary Dahl sold rocks. Actual rocks. Smooth stones of the kind available at any landscaping supplier for the cost of the truck to move them. He placed each rock in a small cardboard box lined with straw, as though the rock were a small animal that needed bedding. He included with each rock a care manual, The Care and Training of Your Pet Rock, which provided instructions on how to teach your pet rock to sit and to stay and to roll over, a maneuver that, the manual acknowledged, required some encouragement on the owner's part, but which the rock was generally willing to attempt if approached with the right spirit. He sold them for $4 apiece. He made $15 million. Now, I want to resist the easy conclusion here, which is that this tells us something damning about the American consumer, or the gullibility of humans, or the triumph of marketing over substance. I want to resist this because I think it is the wrong conclusion, and because I think the right conclusion is more interesting. I think what the pet rock tells us is this. 1975 is a hard year. The city is going broke. The country has just watched a war end badly, and a president resign, and an economy wobble under the pressure of oil prices it cannot control. People are carrying a weight that is real and cumulative, and that has not had for several years anything in particular to laugh about. And Gary Dahl gave them something to laugh about. $4 for a rock in a box. A care manual for a rock. The specific absurdity of teaching a rock to roll over, the shared joke of it, because part of what made the pet rock work was that everyone understood the joke. Everyone was in on it. There was no one being deceived. People bought the pet rock knowing it was a rock. The pleasure was in the knowing. This is what I think. In a year when everything is heavy, people will spend $4 on something that acknowledges the heaviness by being its exact opposite. Something so perfectly, completely silly that for 30 seconds you are not thinking about the deficit, or the Vietnam footage, or the president's face on the resignation night. You are thinking about whether your rock can be trained to sit. I keep coming back to the word I used about Elvis Presley in 1955, which was comprehensible. I find the pet rock comprehensible. Not admirable, not a cultural achievement, not a sign of civilization at its best, but comprehensible. Human. The irrepressible human need for moments of shared, pointless, consequence-free joy, located in the middle of a period that had very little else of that nature to offer. Jack would have bought one. He would have named it. He would have had a whole character worked out for it within a week.